Okay, hello everybody. We're going to be talking mainly about Indigenous American societies in this next series of videos. I'm going to break them up into three parts. So we're going to talk about the Chavin peoples. We are still in period 1 here, okay? Although I will preface this by saying that some of the time overlaps a little bit with the American societies in AP World History. So in other words, we're not adhering strictly to the cutoff date of 600 BCE with period 1 where we're talking about the Americas. I'll clarify that a little bit more in class. Okay, so first off, the general geography. You know what? Before we even get to the Chavin specifically, I want to just talk about some general ideas about American civilization, since this is the first time we're talking about them this year in AP World. First off, we really need to be careful about considering them as a monolithic group of peoples, right? The American societies were very diverse, and a lot of this is because of their interaction with the climate. So all the peoples in both North and South America before European contact evolved into really distinctive cultures when they moved from place to place. The Neolithic Revolution in the Americas occurred around 3000 BCE. That's when you start to see examples of permanent agriculture. It started in present-day Mexico, and the chief crop that they grow is maize or corn. We'll talk about that a little later. I should have added a slide about that, but I did not, so that's a little overview there. So the geography of the Chavin society, all right? You may be asked about their region, or it would be a good idea for you to just know so you can talk about their interaction with the environment. They are in present-day Peru, roughly, okay? Obviously, it does not adhere completely to those modern-day political boundaries, but as you can see, the Chavin people settled on the west coast of South America, and this region, if you're unfamiliar with it, is very mountainous. This is the Andes mountain range, okay? Very, very steep mountain range, prone to earthquakes, and even though they are on the coast, there's a pretty precipitous drop-off, just like if you've ever been to some of the coasts of California, right? So their connection with the ocean was not always particularly strong because many of these societies lived at altitude. So they sort of relied on a smaller group of people to transport goods like fish from the coast into their societies that were at high altitudes. And that actually demonstrates a very sophisticated labor system because they were able to get access to coastal materials despite the challenge of climbing a mountain, literally, to get to their largest cities. And with that said, the geography of the Chavin people did make it difficult for them to have a lot of long-distance trade or just interaction in general. Imagine, even now, if you go visit Machu Picchu, for example, many people are not used to that kind of altitude, and a lot of people get sick, and they actually sort of have to prepare themselves to climb that kind of mountain range. So literally, the people who lived in these societies were physically adapted to live there, right? So even people who still live in these regions of Peru have larger lung capacities than people like us who live closer to sea level. Pretty cool, huh? Anyway, so we do see that there was evidence of some trade among the Chavin peoples, but it was a little bit more localized just because transportation was not very easy because there was such a difficult terrain. As far as agriculture is concerned, again, like some of the earliest American societies, they were big corn farmers. Again, when we talk about corn in the Americas, we call it maize, which is the Spanish word for corn. And then there are a lot of other crops also that they cultivated. Cotton, which obviously was very valuable, and you could turn it into clothing. Potatoes and quinoa, which were very good sustainable foods. Some of the people who engaged in agriculture had to live at lower altitude, and this may be obvious to you, but that's because it's obviously easier to farm where the land is flatter and you have easy access to water. But what you do experience over time is that not just the Chavin people, but a lot of the American societies started to adapt their agricultural methods so they could farm in less friendly environments. So here on the right, you actually see, you see an example of terraced farming. Okay, so terraces are basically, they look like steps, right? And the reason why they make these is because it's much easier to water your crops, grow them, when you have an even patch of land, right? I mean, otherwise, if you're just planting seeds along a mountainside, every time it rains, they're all going to fall to the bottom, right? So this is actually, it may not look impressive to us in 2016, but in 3000 BCE, this was an incredibly sophisticated form of agriculture that, of course, allowed these societies to have a higher population. All right, another thing that they did to get food was they domesticated the llama and also the alpaca, which are animals that are indigenous to the Americas. Now, if you compare these to larger animals like cattle and horses, obviously they are smaller animals. So that did limit other things. Like we said in the previous slide, transportation was difficult. As you could probably surmise, you can't really ride a llama, right? They're not big enough. So that's another reason why. But they were good not only for meat, but also for clothing. You can spin llama and alpaca wool to make very warm clothing, and it did certainly get cold up there in the mountains. They also developed irrigation systems, which sort of go hand in hand with the terraced farming that we see here. And naturally, since they increased and made their agricultural methods more sophisticated, the population started to increase. So at the peak of the Chavin society, you see that there were basically 3 major urban centers of the Chavin peoples, and each of these cities had over 10,000 people living in them, which was impressive for the time. They also show examples of how sophisticated their society was by their art, and also just their trade, what they did to make money. So they were very gifted in metallurgy, right? So basically welding precious metals into things like jewelry and weapons. So you can see a good example. This is a piece of jewelry here that you see was made out of gold. You also see that they were able to solder, right? So melt metals and basically turn them into something new, weld things together. Not weld, that might be the wrong word. But anyway, they were very, very skilled at the metallurgic arts. They also produced pottery. And as I said in the previous slide, with things like llama and alpaca, they were also very gifted in textiles. And so they spun together pieces of clothing, and also these are, not many of these survive, obviously, in present day, but these are examples of also things like rugs, carpets, right? These intricate patterns, which were very common in their textiles. You also see that they were able to weave cotton into things that were more useful, like fish nets. So that's a little artistic rendering of that there. Thought that was cool. Okay, so as far as the social organization is concerned, we do see that most of the Chavin peoples were organized into clans. So basically it was like kinship networks. They all claimed to have a common blood ancestor, and these clans shared land together. So this is sort of unfamiliar when you think about Western society, where private property was common even hundreds of years ago. So basically these people lived together and treated each other as siblings. They helped one another in terms of sharing the duties between agriculture, going to war, and you also see that they distributed their goods somewhat evenly based on these kinship networks. There was a sense of commonality. You were not competing against one another and not sharing, for lack of a better word. You did, though, have some social stratification. I'm not saying that it's all kumbaya and everybody's equal. There was an elite class. People housed themselves separately, so the richer people lived on their own. And you do have examples of the wealthier classes in the Chavin people dressing in more ornate styles. They certainly had more expensive things. We see this in their burial tombs often. So, the examples of jewelry that we saw in this previous slide here, those were things that you would only find among the rich. So it's not completely equal. And you also see that there was a separate class of priests. And religion was very important to the Chavin people. So the priests were sort of they were like nobles, and very, very powerful politically as well. And they controlled all aspects of religious life. And we'll get to that now. So the people in the Chavin region were polytheistic. We already know what this means, but if you forget, they worshiped many gods, right? They did believe in the concept of an underworld, so life after death. And we see that partially because the burial tombs of the wealthiest people in the Chavin have excellent examples of preparing the dead to enter into the afterlife. So you could certainly make a comparison here to societies like ancient Egypt. You do see also that there were large temple complexes that were erected throughout the Chavin region, and you also see really elaborate works of art that connect them to their religion. Their religion is somewhat animalistic, so not animalistic exactly, but ultimately their representation of gods and creatures that one might encounter in the afterlife were not humanistic, as you can see in these examples. They're somewhat humanistic, but they certainly are not they're not lifelike human characters, right? So they used stone as one of the most common materials to carve these examples of the gods. So as far as the political structure is concerned in the Chavin people, and this hopefully is not surprising to you because we saw in that earlier slide that they organized themselves among clans and kinship networks. This sort of connects to the political structure because if you sort of live in these decentralized groups, right, and you rely on one another for food, you're not really likely to live in a super populous region, at least not yet. So you see that there were these urban centers, sort of like these trade stops, but the Chavin society did not have a bustling metropolis that was like a capital city, right? So because of that, we see that the government is very decentralized, which of course made it difficult to unify militarily. And so the Chavin did not exist by the time the Spanish made their way to South America, but the descendants of the Chavin people also were pretty decentralized politically in this region. So the Inca, who came after them, and that certainly could be one of the reasons why they were conquered by the Spanish. But we'll get to that in a future unit. So in any case, what we really see is that the government was pretty localized, right? So the leaders in these different regions of the Chavin society were chiefs, and occasionally you would have one chief who sort of amassed more power and he could call himself a king, but they certainly would fight against one another from time to time, so there was not a ton of political stability. And by no means did you have a political dynasty or anything like that like we saw in China. We do see that there was some political organization, and this was much more apparent when the Chavin population was at its peak. We see this, of course, because you have these urban centers where you do have a lot of examples of trade, and then you also see that agriculture did get more sophisticated as time went on, and that also certainly requires some sort of organized labor, right? You have to sort of divide up people's jobs. And what you also see is that as agriculture became more sophisticated, less people had to farm. And so you're going to see more specialties in labor, people who create metal tools and jewelry, for example. They couldn't have jobs like that if everybody still had to farm. Okay, so we're going to take a break and we're going to come back with the Olmec Society in the next video. So stay tuned, and as always, thanks.